I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we hear from defense editor Dannielle Sheridan about how Ukraine's General Valery Zaluzhny is telling troops that they must be willing to die when they go to war. And former Ukrainian Defense Minister Andrei Zagorodunyuk calls on the West to come up with a positive strategy for victory.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 26th of November, 2 years and 281 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, defence editor Dannielle Sheridan, and Andrei Zagorodunyuk, the former Ukrainian defence minister and director of the Centre for Defence Strategies, a Kyiv defence think tank. I started with the latest news from the battlefield. Russia launched a record 188 drones at Ukraine overnight, hitting critical infrastructure and apartment buildings. That's according to Ukraine's Air Force. The Air Force said it had shot down 76 of the drones, while another 95 were either lost from Air Force radar or downed by electronic jamming devices. It didn't specify what happened to the remainder of those drones. It said Moscow also fired 4 Iskander-M ballistic missiles. A lot of reports of damage across the country in several regions, particularly bad, we're told, in the western region of Ternopil, where the attacks cut off power to around 70% of the region. Vyacheslav Nehoda, the regional governor, said damage was significant and will impact power supply for the entire region for a long time. It also seems to have hit water supplies and disrupted heat supplies. Worrying at this time of year. That's the air war. On the battlefield, in Kursk region, Russia has advanced south of the village of Zelyony Put or Zelyony Shlak, depending on which version of the Slavic languages you're using. That's on the western side of the Ukrainian-held salient. We're told Ukrainian forces have made gains on the eastern side of the salient, near the village of Mariinovka. There's no particular change north of Kharkiv city in the Russian lodgements around Vovchansk. In eastern Kharkiv regions, Russia on Tuesday, today, said its troops have captured the village of Kapanki, that's southeast of Kupiansk. Now, yesterday, Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade said it had cleared Russian troops out of Kapanki and taken several prisoners from Russia's 1st Tank Army. So a bit of back and forth there, but that is a part of the line that's previously been relatively stable. About 30 kilometres south of there, the Russians are also reported to have made gains in the village of Terny. Terny is, again, a place we're hearing a lot of over the past few weeks. Moving south along the line, there is little change in the Siversk salient. Just to remind you, the Siversk salient is the easternmost part of the line held by the Ukrainians, kind of sticking into Russian-controlled territory there. At Chasiv Yar, little change in the city itself, but we are told the Russians are trying to bypass the refractory materials factory in the middle of the city from the south, so trying to kind of outflank on the Russian left, the Ukrainian right there. Little change in the battle for Toretsk, which remains a fairly grim urban battle, as we talked about yesterday. But now we get down south into Karakarov and Velika Novosilka. This is where I'm going to dwell a little bit. The Centre for Defence Strategies, the Kyiv-based defence think tank, which Andrei Zagorodunyuk runs, so we'll ask him a bit more about this shortly, warns that the situation there has become critical. That's their word. So, north of the Karakarov Reservoir, elements of Russia's 90th Tank Division and 51st Army have advanced against that small pocket we've been talking about, or near pocket that's been developing. Now, the Ukrainians seem to have put in a counterattack to cover a phased withdrawal there, so they haven't actually been encircled, which is clearly what the Russians have been trying to achieve for the past week or so. But the CDS says, their assessment, the question of retaining any territory on the northern bank of the Karakarov Reservoir by the Ukrainian Defence Forces is no longer relevant. So that chunk of territory basically gone. South of the reservoir, Russian troops have fought their way westwards into the town of Karakarov itself, and they're also trying to flank it from the south. Now, there is geolocated drone footage this morning, you can see it on our website, showing combat for a building in the centre of town. So we know the Russians have at least reached the middle of that town It kind of stretches along a highway east to west along the southern bank of the reservoir. So they seem to have got about halfway through. They're still trying to push the Ukrainians out of that very small little kind of near pocket south of the town. There's a stream there called the Suhyali River. We've talked about this before. There was a very, very small little kind of almost Ukrainian bridgehead that's been threatened with encirclement again and again over the past week or so. We talked yesterday about how the Russians had made a bit of a breakthrough there over the weekend. The Ukrainians had pulled back. The Russians were not clear on particular changes of territory down there at the moment, but we know the Russians are continuing to push there, and that's going to bring them up to the southern side of Kharkiv, able to attack it from the other side. Precarious situation there for the Ukrainians. Now, about 30 kilometers southwest of Kharkiv, 30, 40 kilometers-ish, I'm approximating, is the town of Velika Novosilka. That is another of the really key Ukrainian strongpoint towns in this part of Donetsk region. Now, CDS reports that Russian forces there have broken through on the eastern side of Velika Novosilka. Their assessment is that it's changed the battlefield situation there in quite a profound way. Essentially, Velika Novosilka was basically facing the Russians to the south of them. Since the fall of Vuhledar, the Russians have been able to kind of push up on one side of the town, and they're now threatening it directly, both from the south and from the east. We are told they've now advanced to within less than 3 kilometers of the T0518 highway. That's the main supply road into Velika Novosilka that runs south from the H15 highway. And the significance of that road is that's the main east-west road running along into Kharkiv further east. The Russians seem to be intent on advancing on a place called Andriivka, which sits on that key road. If they manage to take that, they're still several kilometres short of that, I must say. So I don't think that's going to happen today, tomorrow, or the next day. But it seems to be what they would like to achieve. That will greatly complicate the defence of Kharkiv for obvious reasons. And for that reason, I think listeners should underline that name, Andriivka. I have a feeling that if Ukraine has to retreat from the Kharkiv area, that's going to be part of the new front line. West of Velika Novosilka, the Russians also making gains. They're now, we're told, within about 4 kilometers of the highway that kind of runs west from there, just along behind the front line to Huliapolye, which is the next kind of Ukrainian stronghold on the Zaporizhia front in Zaporizhia region. What you're looking at is quite a precarious situation, particularly in that part of the front for the Ukrainians. That is more or less the military updates this morning. I'd like to bring in Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, who I believe, Joe, has been looking at the political and diplomatic shenanigans over the past 24 hours or so. Joe, I see that Ukraine has called this session of the NATO-Ukraine Council.
Yeah, hi folks, lots to rattle through, and I'm also keen to listen to what Andrei had to say, so I will jump in as quickly as possible. So today in Brussels, we have the Ukraine NATO Council meeting. This was a format of discussion set up between NATO and Ukraine as part of the package that NATO allies offered to Ukraine in lieu of an actual invitation for membership at the Vilnius summit, the summer of 2023. So Ukraine called the meeting today to discuss Russia's launch of the Oryshnik ballistic missile, that terrifying missile that Putin launched, described as a nut, the hazelnut. It apparently hit a munitions factory in the central Ukrainian city of Dnipro. The meeting is being held at the level of ambassadors, so no ministerial input is expected. It's hard to predict exactly what will come out of the meeting, given this focus is on this weapon that is relatively unknown. We know that Putin launched it, and he said, in response to Western support for Ukraine, mainly the issue of ATACMS and Storm Shadow of Scalp being allowed to strike inside of Russia. So what Ukraine will be looking for is reassurances from its Western backers that this perceived escalation by Putin won't deter Western support for Ukraine. But both the US and NATO have already issued statements saying that the Oryshnik missile launch will not deter them from supporting Kyiv. Over to Moscow, where Russia claims it has expelled a British diplomat who goes by the name of Edward Pryor, who was the second secretary in the British embassy in the political realm there. Allegedly, he submitted incorrect paperwork when entering the country. So the FSB has said this diplomat, Mr. Pryor, had replaced an alleged British spy who was expelled earlier this year. Britain's ambassador has been called into the Russian Foreign Ministry for a dressing down, so I've not spoken to the Foreign Office yet. But I do remember, if we cast our mind back to when these spies, and I use sort of inverted commas to describe them, they weren't actually spies, and many of them had actually left the country long before they were expelled by Russia. So sort of just the classic tit-for-tat diplomatic row going on between the UK and Russia. We go over to Cambodia, to the city of Siem Reap, where there is an international conference going on about the present and past use of landmines in the format of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty. Ukraine has a delegation there, essentially reporting back on its use of landmines and asking for help in clearing them in the future, whether they be their own place landmines or the heavily mined areas which have been occupied by Russia currently. I think one of the most interesting elements is there's a group of about 100 protesters that attended, and they were demonstrating against the most recent decision by the US to start sending anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. I think this does need putting in context slightly. We can all agree that we'd love to see a world without landmines. Many of these protesters were actually victims of landmines, but asking Ukraine to give up landmines and not stop using landmines when it has another country's army advancing through its territory is not essentially a reasonable request to make. Both Dom Nichols and Hamish de Bretton-Gordon spoke about the precautions being taken by Ukraine recently in essentially marking down where these mines are being placed, and the US mines that we're using or will be using have come with essentially timers. Their batteries run out and it is meant to render them ineffective, basically to stop people treading on them in the future. Back to Moscow, where there's been some interesting comments from Russia's top spy, a Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. And according to the Reuters news agency, he says Russia opposes simply freezing the conflict in Ukraine because Moscow needs a, and I open quote, solid and long-term peace clause that resolves the core reasons for this crisis. He says Moscow is ready to sit down and hold negotiations, but I'm not entirely sure how seriously we should be taking Mr. Naryshkin's comments, to be honest. They are straight out of the Kremlin's classic playbook, the lines to take that Putin and his cronies sort of lean to every time they speak. So Putin always complains about sort of NATO expansionism, even when it wasn't expanding before he invaded Ukraine. He talked about NATO placing weapons close to Russian borders, etc. That wasn't happening en masse until Russia invaded Ukraine. And then I'm sure they'll add in a sprinkle of the Nazi regime and that needs toppling in Kyiv as the cherry on top. So the solid and long-term peace that resolves the core reasons for this crisis, yeah, it's whatever Moscow says, its justifications mainly sort of complete and utter codswallop. So I think something that also needs addressing from these comments is, look, there's currently no incentive for Putin to come to any negotiating table. His troops are advancing across pretty much the entirety of the front line. Western support seems to be in a bit of a lull at the moment. We have these removals of restrictions on Storm Shadow and ATACMS, but we're living in a world where President-elect Donald Trump, everyone believes that he is going to sit down in office on the first day and demand a deal that basically cedes about a fifth of Ukrainian territory to Russia. And then just to round off, there have been a few remarks on this Le Monde story, the French newspaper, that reported yesterday that France and Britain were ready to send troops to Ukraine in some capacity. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, has addressed this issue by saying, "We are not committing UK troops on the ground to Ukraine, but we continue to support Ukraine with training and military assistance, and we have been absolutely clear that we will continue to do that for as long as is required and is needed. That is certainly the UK position and remains the UK position at this time." Categorical is ruling out the deployment of British troops. Interesting from Estonia's Defence Minister, Hanno Pevkur, who says Ukraine needs greater investment in its military production capabilities and not foreign troops deployed on the battlefield. This is what he has to say, and this is according to The Hill, which is a political publication in the US. "As far as I know, Ukrainians can handle all of this when we can deliver all what they need for fighting with Russia." Then he went on to advocate for boosting Ukraine's domestic defence industry, something that countries like Denmark is doing by investing directly in Ukraine's defence industrial sector rather than giving it weapons. And it's something that the UK, Germany, Poland and Italy have pledged to do the same. Mr. Pevka went on to say their industry is really ramping up production, but it only has $15 billion to spend, while its capacity is about $30 billion. So when you don't have anything to give for your own stockpiles and give them money, it's a simple message. Yep, so very interesting stuff from the Estonian Defence Minister, and I will stop there and pass back to you, Roland.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. On that topic of international help, last week, I think it marked 1,000 days of the war. Ukraine's ambassador to Britain, Valery Zaluzhny, went to visit Ukrainian troops training in Britain and gave them an interesting pep talk. Our defence editor, Dannielle Sheridan, was there. Danny, you wrote this up last week in a very interesting colour piece with all kinds of details about how modern training has adapted to lessons from the battlefield, but also some pretty, this description of what sounded like a pretty, I'm trying to find the words, unvarnished, brutal might be one word, kind of no sugarcoating kind of speech that General Zaluzhny gave to the troops. Tell us about this.
Yes, I agree with what you've just said. We were invited down as reporters, myself and a couple of others, to watch Ukrainian recruits taking part in Op Interflex, which is training them up. They come to the UK for up to 10 weeks before they go back to the front line and fight. What was the most interesting aspect of the day wasn't actually seeing them enact trench warfare. It was seeing how these troops responded to General Zaluzhny's appearance. So as I understand it was only kind of organised quite last minute, and it was 1,000 days of the war. So, morale isn't at its highest. People are burnt out. They're tired. There's no end in sight. And then the general turned up. And to be honest, he's considered a bit of a legend, for want of a better word, among these people. And it was so amazing to see how they interacted with him and also how it was reciprocated. He was fist pumping them, posing for selfies. It was like a celebrity had turned up for these guys. I was rereading my interview ahead of coming on here, and I forgot that a young recruit, a 31-year-old man, was saying that for them, General Zaluzhny is like their father, and that he represents a kind of calmness among fighters. It was really special to see, and he delivered a speech in Ukrainian to the recruits. They all gathered round, hanging on every single word he had to say. At the end, when he, finished his speech with the usual Slava Ukrainia, their response, Horoyam Slava, honestly sent chills down my spine. It was as if I was suddenly in a church or something and hearing people unite in a chorus to pray. Like, it was really moving. And when I don't speak Ukrainian, I got the transcript of the speech afterwards. When I then understood what he had said to them to kind of initiate such a rousing response, I was really blown away. I'm just going to read you one short passage. This is General Zaluzhny telling men who've come over to the UK to train. We have only one Ukraine. No one will defend it except us. Remember that war is becoming more cruel every day. It leaves almost no chance of survival. Learn not to be afraid of death. So he's telling these young men that there's a chance that when you guys return, you're going to die. And that's something they have to make their peace with. And it really hit home. I found it really striking. And also their resolve was what was so impressive. Like I said, you could have heard a pin drop when this man was speaking. They were all so devoted to what he was saying. And yet, when he's finished, it's suddenly a time for selfies and fist pumps, and their mood was boosted, but with this underlying kind of narrative that they've been warned, don't be afraid of death. It's coming. One last thing I'd add is that I spoke to the CO, the commanding officer of 3 Scots, who's training this division currently. And I asked him, do you ever have to steel yourself from getting attached to any of the guys? They're here for 10 weeks. You must have kind of built up some sort of wall to stop yourself getting too fond of them, knowing that perhaps a terrible fate awaits them when they return to Ukraine. And he did admit that that is something he struggles with. And, the British military, very, very stoical, have procedures in places to deal with this kind of stuff. But he did say that, at the end of the day, they're humans, and it is hard to stop yourself from becoming mates with these guys and then knowing that they could die.
Danny, thank you so much for that. That dispatch is it's on the website. I'd encourage anyone to go and read it. It tells you a lot also about how they've adapted water bombs to drop from drones to simulate kind of grenade dropping drones and stuff. So fascinating stuff. I'd like to finally bring in then Andrei Zagorodunyuk, the former Ukrainian Defence Minister, current director of the Centre for Defence Studies. Andrei, thank you for joining us. Thank you. You've listened very, very patiently. I kind of wanted to straight away kind of get your reaction to what Danny just said and that description, because, you know, we hear a lot about high casualties, about a manpower problem, about the serious challenges on the front that we talked about in the military updates, and yet here at this particular training ground, when General Zaluzhny shows up, there still seems to be this incredible amount of resolve. You're ex-defence minister. I mean, you know Zaluzhny. What's your take on this? What does that kind of thing say about the state of the war and morale in the armed forces?
Well, there's quite a lot to say, to be honest. I mean, this was really extremely emotional moment, and thank you, Dannielle, for describing it so well. Immediate thing is that, of course, Zaluzhny is extremely charismatic general. He's very, very popular among the troops. He's very popular among civilians in Ukraine, and I'm sure that for the soldiers who's been in the training field, it was a great privilege and something they would tell for a long time, that they have seen Zaluzhny, that they have listened to him, and so on. That said, we know that during all long wars, there's been that phenomena of popular generals, because the people who are fighting, the people who are getting ready to fight, they do tend to look up at the popular generals and the talented generals and the generals which are very well known. People need those heroes. People need those professional and popular and very well known with a great track record generals. But of course, that's just an emotional element. The other element is that indeed we're talking about an extremely bloody war. We're talking about the war which has very high rate of casualties, and there is a great risk that many of those guys may not survive, or at least survive intact by the end of this war. And we don't know when the war ends. You know, all those discussions about the manpower, all those discussions about the casualties and about the progress on the front, and what you just started this podcast with the review of, it all boils down to the fact that this war is still being fought primarily on land, primarily in the infantry level, and primarily in a so-called tactical depths, which means that very, very close to the front. And that's what we've been trying to deal with for all these years, because that's always been considered as something which Ukraine needs to address and its allies needs to address, because those wars are extremely high on casualties and very, very difficult to win. NATO would have a very different setting completely. NATO would make sure that when the enemy adversary arrives to the front, they're in the worst possible shape and perhaps not arriving in one piece at all. So they would use the long-range weapons, they would use the aviation, they would use all kind of a long-range sort of capabilities possible and as long as possible in order to keep the first echelon, to keep the infantry intact as much as possible. And that's the whole war-fighting doctrine of NATO is all about. So essentially, since perhaps the World War II and then early wars such as war in Korea, war in Vietnam. Since then, the focus on the long-range weapons was a key. And that's why this is extremely painful, I have to say. There's been to look at those decisions made about the allowing Ukraine to strike on the Russian territory. Because those decisions, when they weren't made, and I have to remind that we're almost 3 years into the war, and several years we've been pushing for provisions of the long-range weapons, and then months and months we've been pushing for allowing to strike to the Russian territory. So all these decisions, they essentially just put more burden on the infantry. So they're putting more burden on the people who are on the front. I don't want to say unfair burden, but this is certainly a burden which would NATO never put on its own troops, ever. So that's basically the biggest dilemma right now, how still to provide capabilities to Ukrainian forces that they can actually fight modern war. Well, the war according to the approaches which would be taken by its partners. And we're still not there. So apart from drones, which is obviously a huge innovation of this war, unseen before, the operation setting of this war is extremely old-fashioned. And this is more, you would rather see that in like tens of years ago rather than now. That's the biggest thing which breaks hearts of people who are dealing with this, because they know that we could avoid that rate of casualties. We could have avoided those problems with mobilization, but we're still struggling with this.
Since you brought it up there straight away, we do seem to be in this weird, I don't know, but it's this moment of sudden change, really, and it seems to have come about since Donald Trump won the American election. We've suddenly had, the Americans granting the permission to use ATACMS in Russia. We've seen the UK grant permission for Storm Shadows. We saw the news today that Bloomberg reported overnight that Britain's actually sent another batch of Storm Shadows. We don't know how many, but they've resupplied the Ukrainians with more of them. There are landmines coming. I mean, is this all too little too late, in your view, or does that stand a chance of changing this very difficult dynamic at the front that we described at the beginning of the podcast?
Well, of course, the situation is always complicated. From one hand, we're absolutely grateful to partners for support, because without that support, Ukraine would be in an incredibly more difficult situation than now, to say at least. At the same time, we can go back to just a general theory of conflict and see it from that side. If the situation is getting about to start the war, obviously you would try to do whatever possible in order to de-escalate and in order to sort of avoid the war by all means, because as we can see now, and we have seen that for 10 years, since 2014, the war is better to be avoided by all means possible. So, and Ukraine is not enjoying that for a moment, at all. So we do no price of peace, let's put it this way. But there are situations when negotiations or a reasonable discussion is not helping. And these situations is that when things become existential. So in our case, this is when Russia clearly demonstrated that it's not interested in a peaceful resolution. It's interested in Ukraine losing its sovereignty and so on and so on. So then when the things became crucial in terms of we either win or die, there were points of time, and obviously the most obvious one is the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when these things became evident. So when Russia clearly demonstrated no need to any sort of civilized discussion, they just wanted to get rid of Ukraine from the map. So at those points of time, there is a dilemma which is still existent, unfortunately. And dilemma is, are you escalate a little bit by little bit, or you are trying to win? And unfortunately, that dilemma never been answered properly by White House administration. At the same time, as we all know, the international support to Ukraine is being done through the so-called Ramstein format, where all countries are have to follow one pattern. Obviously, United States government has the key seat on that table, and so that's why there's many weapons being provided by other allies, including UK, after the United States decided that this is okay to provide them, or permissions to strike to Russian territory, as we could see in this case. So what I mean by escalate little by little or win straight away, Russia had a certain capabilities deployed to their theater, and we clearly understood that in order to address those, we needed some, again, long-range weapons and so on and so on. At the same time, the provision of weapons has been done in sort of batches and stages. And after very significant discussions and sort of advocacy and negotiations and so on, and usually as soon as certain types of weapons were provided, they were provided in very small batches for various reasons. But let me remind you that 2.5 years ago, the first long-range weapons such as howitzers, which are now considered as normal and nothing quite ordinary in the front, they were provided in a quantity of 7 for the whole 1,500 kilometer front. And then they started to be increased and so on and so on. So that all goes step by step. And also what we could see is that provision of certain types of weapons, including Patriot missiles, for example, which are also quite common right now in Ukraine, they've been provided after some serious escalations of the war. So they were provided as a response to the certain actions Russia did, either destruction of civilian buildings or some serious harm or any other types of escalation, conventional escalation. So essentially, this is a game of response to response and then response to response and so on. So right now, the permission to strike to Russian territory has been granted as a response to Russia bringing Northern Korean troops. And as a response to that response, Russia made a whole disinformation campaign about striking with the new type of weapon and so on and so on. And information element was a huge part of it, if not bigger than the actually kinetic. So basically, we are playing the escalation game. this escalation game, and it's called escalation ladder in a war theory. So basically, it's like you're constantly stepping up. This is extremely dangerous game, and this is a game which may have no resolution because Russia then will have to do something, and then will have to do something, and so on and so on. And this thing may never stop because it's essentially like a well-known chicken game in the game theory, played with on a kind of like a huge war level. The other option was to develop a campaign plan which would do a resolve blow to Russia militarily on the field, that they can start losing operations and they can realize that they're not going to win and they need to cut losses and they need to understand that something is going to happen very bad unless they stop. But that decision has never been taken. And the latest attempt was by President Zelensky to bring that victory plan, which contained some elements of that other option. And unfortunately, as we can see, it's been discussed still. But the current administration is yet to stay for a month or so. So basically, I don't think it's going to be any decision made on that. So we are in a sort of war setting, which is very, very dangerous. And that's why many people looking actually up to President Trump, thinking that, well, if he can change the course of game, maybe that's actually even better. But of course, the risk is that nobody knows, nobody has any idea how he's planning to do that. And that's a huge risk on its own.
Thank you for that, Andrei. On this topic of Western support, I know Danny's got a follow-up question. Danny, go ahead.
Thank you. I was interested to know if there was concern in Ukraine that British stockpiles of Storm Shadow might be running low. Do you get any sense of how long the UK can continue sending this equipment out to Ukraine?
Unfortunately, the answer is never straightforward, because the question is how long always depends what we use it for. Because if we want to win the whole war with the long-range missiles, just using them as a sort of magic weapon, that's not going to happen, and there's always going to be a shortage. When there is no approved campaign plan between the partners, let's call it let's say Rammstein coalition, we have allies, right? And let's say that we don't have the approved campaign plan. Then we are in the war strategy, which is called war of attrition, which means that we're trying to exhaust Russians by destroying their objects, like high-value targets, and then just waiting until they run out of resources. That war is very, very, very also dangerous because we don't know how resilient Russians are. And as we could see, they have a substantial resilience to losses, because 700,000 losses, nobody would think 3 years ago that would be not a showstopper for Russia. Well, everybody would think it would be, but it's not. And so on and so on. So clearly this war is existential for Putin, and clearly he doesn't want to stop. So war of attrition perhaps is not the wisest strategy. And any single general who you speak to, they will probably confirm you that we should be really counting on that strategy. Alternative, again, would be campaign plan, like a resolve campaign plan, in which those weapons would be part of a larger portfolio and they would play a certain role. And then I don't think there would be a shortage of them. So the answer, in order to not to create a shortage of weapons, the weapons should be part of the ambitious campaign plan, where they are part of the combined arm portfolio, and then it would be a totally different situation. And I believe we're still on the process of proving that.
Thank you. So no single weapon can win this war?
Oh, absolutely. And there's no magic weapon at all. I mean, even if we're talking about aviation or anything, it all should work in a concerted manner, combined armed operation approach, and very, very robust campaign plan with a clear objective operational goals. Only then you can evaluate how enough there is something.
Joe, I think you had another question as well.
Yeah, Andrei, fascinating stuff. Thank you for joining us. So I just wanted to address the issue of manpower with you. Last week, Russia's Jack Watlin wrote Ukraine is rapidly approaching a point where if it does not address the manpower issue, then it will struggle to defend the length of the front, and so the collapse in its fighting positions will accelerate. I was in the US ahead of the US elections, and people I spoke to in Washington would argue that neither President Trump or Harris, whoever won the election, would be able to fix Ukraine's number one issue, and they listed that as manpower. So I wanted to get your take on what Ukraine is doing to address the issue of manpower. And I guess you can label it as a criticism from some of the Western sort of analysts I've been speaking to. They say that Ukraine is looking to build 14 new brigades with new recruits rather than using new recruits to essentially fill in and replace the losses being suffered on the front line. So, yeah, I'd be really interested in your take on that, please, Andrew.
Well, there is always a debate here about like whether we should complete new brigades or whether we should just replenish the previous ones. And there are pros and cons in each of these sides, and it's up to the military command to decide. And this is a very basically an equation with lots of the elements, because you need to take care about the infrastructure support, you need to take care about the command, which brigades are better run, whether they have fresh forces, and so on and so on. So this is like it's not a simple answer, and most likely it's going to be different brigades will have different futures. So some of them would be kind of reduced, and some of them would be enlarged, and then the new ones would replace the ones which reduced. Bigger issue though is that whether Ukraine generally has enough people to sustain that fight. Again, there are two approaches to this. I cannot stress enough how strong our opinion is about the approach which we have. The thing is that if we extrapolate the existing reality into the future, no country would be able to sustain that fight, because that fight is too infantry focused, and it's too focused on land, and it's too focused on a shallow zone of like near the front line. So it's basically like you have a two armies clashing on the front in a sort of 19th, 18th century, World War II century sort of style. It's literally grinding the force, constantly creating the casualties. And that's basically a Russian playbook, very clear, because they don't mind. They, at least for the nearby future, they don't mind losing another 100,000. So for them, it seems like not a big deal, particularly if these 100,000 maybe are North Koreans. So essentially right now, we see some, videos coming from the front. We see some information from our soldiers. Russians are literally, they don't care about the people at all. So they send them, they lose them. In some areas of the assaults, the rate of loss is like 90%, and they're fine about this. So basically, if we rephrase your question to a question like how long we're able to sustain that fight, that type of a fight, and of course then the question would be like, do we really want to sustain that type of a fight? Or maybe we should pay some attention to change the modality of this game, and change the modality of the operational setting. And I believe that, just extrapolating the existing situation and saying, okay, so how long? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? It's a wrong question. Because, yes, for some period of time, mathematically, as Rusi was also writing about, mathematically, Ukraine still have population. But then there were like discussion about like, oh, why don't Ukraine mobilize as 18-year-olds? Oh, there's one general from one of the European countries suggests that why Ukraine doesn't mobilize women. All these discussions are completely missing the point that, we could have a different war. United States government is complaining about, providing too much money for Ukraine. Well, at least upcoming government, let's put it this way. And they're talking about hundreds of millions and so on and so on. Despite of all these hundreds of millions, Ukraine still doesn't have a single competitive aircraft which can keep Russian aviation away from the front. And establishing air superiority, or at least denying adversaries' air superiority, is absolutely key provision for any war-fighting concept. And still, Ukraine cannot establish this because there is, despite even of the F-16s provided, they are not competitive against Russian aviation. So what happens right now is that Ukrainian infantry buying time until the coalition figures out a better way to set a better operational setting.
Really fascinating and really important that we get the Ukrainian perspective on that. One last question for me. Part of having permission to fire into Russia is all about interrupting logistics nodes, command and control, basically unsettling Russia's positions on the front line. Is there also, as part of like Zelensky's victory plan, as I reported once upon a time, that there would be a coherent strategy about how to use ground forces to capitalize on this, the loosening of restrictions by the US, UK and France? How long do you think it's going to take for us to sort of start seeing effects and stuff like that? What's your feeling from the ground?
Unfortunately, I cannot comment on that. Because it's not exactly something which we can go through for many, many reasons. But yes, so short answer is yes, it is addressed. Ukrainian command, they know obviously about these modern methods of war fighting. They obviously addressed that for a long time. Some of let's put it this way. The first request for ATACMS came in April 2022. The first request for the planes came in March 2022. So these questions have been boiling around for years now. To quickly answer your question is like whatever the propositions by Ukrainian government, yes, they address that. And yes, they do know, they have a very good understanding how this can be changed and evolved. It's more political question right now than the military.
For the past week, our regular presenters, Francis Dearnley and Dominic Nichols, have been on assignment in Ukraine. In June, Francis met with the NGO Ukraine Focus in Normandy for the 80th anniversary of D-Day before joining them on part of their journey driving ambulances to be delivered to the front lines in Ukraine. Each ambulance is reported to save 250 lives per month, and many listeners were inspired to support the organisation, with NASA astronaut Terry Virts one of those who heard the episode and joined them for future missions. In Kiev, Francis met up again with Brock Bierman, the head of Ukraine Focus, along with Terry and one of the other major supporters, as they arrived at the Ukrainian capital, ready to deliver the next tranche of ambulances they'd driven across Europe. This is their conversation at a Napoleon-themed restaurant in the centre of Kiev.
Well, Brock, we're in central Kyiv. It's been a few months, but you and I have stayed in touch. Real pleasure to see you again, albeit, of course, in challenging circumstances. There was an air raid siren going off just a few hours ago. What's been happening since the last time that you and I were sharing an ambulance together?
Well, we've been working 24/7. We haven't stopped since the last time we saw one another. We really have continued on. After we delivered those 40 ambulances, actually, it ended up being 42 by the time it was over, with Terry Virts, who, by the way, I met through your program. He called, actually had listened to the first program, and then he called me, and the next thing you know, he's helping me in Normandy, and we're driving a second D-Day mission, if you will, all the way from Normandy to Kyiv, and we did that with Terry.
And just to remind listeners, Terry is the NASA astronaut, our go-to man on rockets. Brock, I mean, wow, what a time in the last few weeks with Trump's victory. Interested in your perspective as somebody, of course, fluent in American politics and has worked in that world for a very long time. Did you see it coming, and what do you think the ramifications could be for the war?
So look, yeah, I actually did see it coming. I mean, I think that I was not surprised, and I'm actually optimistic. Look, I'm a student of history, and if you look at what President Trump did during his administration, he was tough on Putin. He supplied javelins. History is what you really need to look at, and the history says he's going to be tough on Putin, and I think we're going to see that. But ultimately, we have seen continued support, and we're a bipartisan agency, or organization rather, and we're not looking to take sides. We clearly don't get involved with the politics side, but we have seen increased support. We've seen increased ambulances. Today we just delivered our 255th ambulance, which was absolutely fantastic. Terry Virts came on this mission again. This is his second mission, and we've had a great group of volunteers. And we continue to see enthusiasm, not just to help us, but to help their Ukrainian people.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's 250 lives per month saved by per ambulance?
250 lives per month per ambulance, yeah.
So, and of course, many listeners to our programme have donated and supported Ukraine Focus in their own ways, for which, of course, I know that you're extremely grateful because you've articulated as such.
No, and look, I have to keep positive, regardless of the aspect of what Putin is doing and the increased amount of drones. We're going to continue to push back on him in every way we possibly can. There's nothing that we won't leave off the table in terms of our support. I'm just so fortunate to have so many people helping us along the way and getting us to where we are right now.
Well, Terry Virts, it's been, gosh, how many months we've been liaising? Years, in fact. And yet finally, here we are in Kyiv, face to face. It's a real pleasure to finally speak to you in person. So perhaps you can just remind those listeners who aren't familiar with your background, extraordinary background, probably the only man in Kyiv who's been to space, I would guess, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe that's a stretch too far. But tell us about your background and your involvement in the Ukraine Focus project and how you heard about it.
Sure. Well, I had been a U.S. Air Force F-16 pilot for about a decade. Then I went to NASA as an astronaut, flew twice on the space shuttle and on a Russian Soyuz. Spent a little over 7 months in space, which was amazing. in my post-NASA career, and I listen to Ukraine the latest, I'm a big fan of democracy, and I'm not a fan of authoritarian dictatorships, destroying our friends and allies. So I listen to your pod every day, you and what David created, and Dom, even though he's a helicopter guy, he's still he's not a fighter pilot, so he's not that cool, but he's sort of cool.
You hear that, Dom? I didn't pay him to say that at all. Not at all.
So I've listened literally every day now for 1,000 days, which is just horrendous. I heard Brock on a few months ago, and I thought, man, what a great mission. I wish I was Secretary of State. I wish I was Secretary of Defense. I wish I was National Security Advisor. I'm not. But delivering ambulances to Ukraine is one tangible thing I can do. And this war has huge implications way beyond just Ukraine. And so one day I'm going to tell my kids, my grandkids, what did you do during this war? And this is something I can tell them that I did.
What's your mood at the moment? We've heard optimistic opinions about the Trump presidency. We've heard perspectives on the ground in Kyiv, which fluctuates between concern versus optimism, because it's finally a change of axis from where we were, or what it felt like we were heading. What's your perspective at this precarious moment, and what do you feel is your sense of the mood amongst those that you've spoken to, whether it be in the United States in very senior positions, or even individuals that you've spoken to here in Ukraine?
That's an interesting question. My perspective as an astronaut, when you look back at Earth, I remember this one time I was like, man, that's my planet over there and I'm not on it. And you just think, man, that planet's been around for a long time, and it's going to be around for a long, long, long time. And these guys like Vladimir Putin, they think they're important. They're not. Like, the planet will go on, the universe will go on. And the big picture for Ukraine is an upward trajectory. Like the graph of Ukraine is pointed upward. It's going to join Europe eventually. I think it's going to join NATO eventually. It's a country that has fought for freedom, unlike every other country that we know, for several generations. I think the trajectory for Ukraine is upward. I think the trajectory for Russia is downward. Just in every possible way, Putin has cemented his country's demise over the next century. The question is, there's men tonight on the front line. We were just in the biggest ever attack that Russia did on Ukraine just the other day, or one of the biggest. So in the short term, they need to win this war to the maximum extent possible. The good news is there's a change coming. And what America has done has been excruciating. What Biden and Jake Sullivan have done have been just excruciating for this poor country. Not giving them what they want. We know what they need to win, and we haven't given it to them. If they only had allies like North Korea and Iran. Russia has great allies. They give Russia what they need. It's a transactional relationship, but Russia has allies that they can depend on, and Ukraine has really struggled with that. The problem is a lot of the folks in the Trump administration are kind of TikTok generation, war is evil. They're very extremely anti-Ukraine. So I hope that President Trump has the wisdom to go, this is his chance. And I'll say this, and this is a real hope I think that Ukrainians have. He can be the president that defeats Russia. He can be the president that shows Joe Biden has been very weak, and this is his chance to actually defeat Russia. It's a huge opportunity. And I hope that he has the wisdom and to see that. I think if he does, this war could be over very quickly, just like World War I was. We always talk about the World War II analogies. You're a historian. You know better than I do. But in a lot of ways, this is more 1918. The Americans came in, a little bit of push, and the dominoes fell really quickly. And this war, by the way, Russia is suffering terribly. Their army is almost completely destroyed. Kursk is full of destroyed Russian vehicles. Like, the Russian army is in terrible shape, and this weird perverted wing that thinks that Russia's undefeatable and we can't do anything is just wrong. They are in a really bad shape. Ukraine's in bad shape too. They've lost a huge amount of people. But if we can give them the push that they need, I think it can be like the summer of 1918. As a historian, you know better than I do what that means. So I'm hopeful. I hope the right people make the right decisions.
So, Brent, thank you very much for your time today. We're meeting in Kyiv, and wow, I mean, what a project that's evolved over that sustained period that you've been involved with it. I know now that you're involved in funding a hospital in Bucha, where you just passed through, we just were, and heard an air raid siren there, which of course is a very frequent experience here in Kyiv. But why Bucha, and why do you think it's so impossible to be investing in healthcare in Ukraine now? The war's not over yet.
Well, the war's not over, but the demand for health care is still high. In fact, during the war, the Russians have damaged or destroyed over 1,500 healthcare facilities, almost all of those intentionally. They were in Bucha. They damaged the hospital there. It is back. It is operative, but it was certainly damaged, and it needs expansion. There is an increasing demand for mental health services and for rehabilitation services. Bucha is going to be a combination of a mental health facility and expansion of that hospital, but also a rehab facility for people who are wounded, mostly in the war. There's a 3D printing lab. It's very difficult, as you might imagine, to get around this area and going from one physician's office to another and getting one fitting after another, and transportation is difficult. The air raid sirens are going off. Everything is increasingly complex. So to have something that's close to home, close to where the damage was, and the scene of some of the absolute worst atrocities of the war in Bucha. So this hospital will serve people who are both veterans and civilians who were wounded there.
That kind of investment that you've just described there requires a belief in Ukraine's future and in the vision of it being part of the West. What is to you that vision in, let's say, 5 to 10 years' time? Paint me a picture.
Well, I think it's a robust healthcare delivery system that doesn't fully exist now. I mean, there are pockets of good care. There are good doctors, and there's dedicated nurses, and they do heroic work in the facilities that they have. But everywhere I've been that is a public hospital has needed renovation, massive renovation or replacement. I mean, it's just it's not what you expect in the EU, and they are still turning out good work. And they get 4 people in a room and a bathroom down the hall, and old facilities that are spread out, and it just simply needs to be upgraded. But these are job creators too. I mean, if you think about healthcare, it's a great economic engine in the economy, and a lot of these jobs are female-dominated jobs. You know, in the States and in Western Europe, these are middle-class jobs, and they are ways to move an economy and move people up, where they're buying homes, they're buying cars, and they're buying consumer goods. And we're not just improving health care, we're going to improve the economics and the well-being of the community. We're also going to drive jobs in that community. And people don't want to go to communities where there isn't good health care. So we're going to jump in and provide, just as we did after World War II, an improved product with American products and American ingenuity. We're going to improve their lives, and it's a mission we're proud to be on.
Well, it's refreshing to hear an optimistic perspective, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. Going to go to the final thoughts, starting with, let's see, Joe Barnes. What would you like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, rather a question. Is there going to be a renewed pressure on Germany, despite what's going on domestically with them, to allow donations of their Taurus long-range missile? Danny was speaking about the sort of concerns about shortage of Storm Shadow. They exist in Britain, they exist in France with the Scalp. I don't believe they're made anymore from the top of my mind, or at least not sort of en masse. Now, Ukraine has been given permission to strike across the Russian border, which increases the number of targets available to it, but it doesn't increase the number of missiles available to it. And there's still plenty of targets in Crimea, in other occupied areas of Ukraine, that will still need coverage from, whether it be ATACMS or Storm Shadows or Scalps. The question is, does Ukraine have sort of the number of missiles available from it, from the US, UK, France, Italy as well? So maybe there's going to be a renewed pressure campaign on Germany to sort of alleviate the pressures of numbers by donating some Taurus, as we saw with the Free the Leopards campaign, when essentially the whole world was lobbying Germany to allow export of Leopard 2 main battle tanks to Ukraine. But I think that's an interesting thing to look out for, and whether that starts up in conversations again.
Thank you, Joe. Danny Sheridan.
I think my final thought goes back to the Ukrainian fighters I met last week, that as long as the West dithers on how much equipment it's going to be sending and for how long, and there's constant worry that Ukraine isn't getting enough, it's the lives of these men that are lost in the process, and that's what kind of stays with me throughout this conversation.
Thank you very much, Danny. Andrei Zagorodnyuk, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Well, thank you for inviting. We are in an extremely crucial moment. Not the first time, but nevertheless. We see a lot of the speculations about what Trump's administration may do about that. The United States is still playing a crucial role in the survival of Ukraine. We clearly see that around the new administration, there are lots of Russian narratives flowing around among all kinds of different people. Lots of people who are not necessarily making decisions, but may try to influence them. They do kind of play with some of the very dangerous kind of positions and so on. So, yeah, that makes us quite nervous. We would like to, of course, them to see the strategic picture of this. And the strategic picture is that a stopping of this war is only possible through coercing Russia to stop rather than playing a weak hand. They will never, ever agree on stopping this war if they see that they can get more. So hence the support to Ukraine, hence to approving some kind of campaign plans, either the ones which are in the presidential victory plan or some other ones, but there needs to be some constructive approach rather than just going forward or thinking about just stopping it because we want to stop it. But we are in a very, very difficult time, and thank you for being with us. This is extremely appreciated.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for £1 at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same thing for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.